Thanks everyone for coming out. I'm going to talk a little bit about what I observed around Caracas, and we will show you some of our video. You can see all of our work at thegrayzone.com. That's G-R-A-Y, and it's not a hair club for men. It's a news site. Just as a disclaimer, we took no government funding at any point in our reporting on Venezuela, and or in coming here, Nicole has sponsored our trip along with myself. I've paid partly out of pocket to come here because it's so important for me to have this audience. I arrived in Caracas in early February with the expectation of witnessing at least some mild version of the dystopia that Western media has made out Venezuela to be. What I found instead was a society coping with an economic crisis, to be sure, brought on by speculation, hyperinflation, and tightening U.S. economic blockade, but one that was coping nonetheless. I came from Washington, D.C., where I live in one of the city's most neglected, impoverished communities in southeast Anacostia, whose residents are struggling to remain in their homes against rising rents and declining wages, and where I witnessed literally thousands of men and women sleeping in the streets every day just blocks from the White House. And, you know, coming from there, the situation around Caracas scarcely resembles a humanitarian crisis, at least as I understood it, especially after having worked so long inside and writing about the Gaza Strip, which is still under occupation and is the target of a project of Israeli apartheid. That's a real humanitarian crisis. It is a man-made humanitarian crisis. And speaking to my friend Tarek Lubani, who also works on Gaza, and hearing about the situation and having him tell me, well, it's slightly better. We now have 8 hours of electricity a day. That gives you a sense of the kind of double standards that we're operating from. Around Caracas, I witnessed scenes of community and humanity that were scarcely conveyed by Western media intent on demonizing Venezuela, which were generally enabled thanks to state intervention. I visited the Gran Misión Vivienda, a massive complex constructed according to Jane Jacobs' model of a mixed-use urban development that was built on a military base that provides affordable housing to some 20,000 families. It was constructed under the watch of the late President Hugo Chavez, and it's at the heart of a largely successful government plan to provide free or affordable housing to 3 million families by this year. At Comuna Panal, a government housing collective which is home to some 3,500 families high above Caracas, I witnessed a performance of Afro-Venezuelan music at a school that provides free music instruction to young children. The opposition-controlled National Assembly has introduced the housing privatization law to unravel and destroy these achievements in housing. This law is rejected by 61% of Venezuelans, yet it is at the heart of self-declared interim President Juan Guaido's agenda. It represents a nightmare for the millions who gained homes under the Bolivarian Revolution. Each week, the municipal government of Caracas hosts open-air food markets around the city to provide affordable food and sanitary supplies to poor and working-class residents. And as you'll see in the video that we show after Anya's presentation, the markets sell a variety of state-subsidized food at well below market value. The markets are complemented by the food distribution program known as CLAP, which has been heavily criticized by the opposition and the Western media that embeds among it, which they call it an instrument of state control. Yet the program provides 1 to 2 weeks worth of food virtually for free, 12 cents a box, along with sanitary supplies. Erica Ferias, the mayor of Caracas, told us that the government plans to double its distribution of the CLAP boxes to twice a month. The opposition has placed the CLAP program in its crosshairs as well, as it has announced plans to sell off the country's state oil company, which makes such programs possible. In order to generate the narrative of a humanitarian crisis, Western outlets like CNN have routinely claimed that basic foodstuffs are simply unavailable in Venezuela, that you, for example, can't even find toothpaste or toothbrushes. As you will see in our video at the end, that is a titanic lie. The problem isn't food availability, but the buying power of the Venezuelan public, which proposed U.S. sanctions on Visa and MasterCard aim to weaken even further. At a supermarket in the affluent neighborhood of Altamira, I was able to find everything I get at home in Washington, D.C., including toilet paper scented with chamomile and aloe vera. Relaxing. Nearby were sushi and juice bars, yoga studios, restaurants of every variety, and shopping malls where the latest luxury products and spa services were readily available. Touring the upscale areas of eastern Caracas offers a window into the irony of Venezuela's polarized politics. These bubbles of wealth are opposition strongholds, and while food is plentiful, you are most likely to hear calls for humanitarian intervention in these quarters. On February 12th, we witnessed a large opposition rally headlined by self-declared interim President Guaido, who called for the U.S. to deliver aid from Colombia against the wishes of Venezuela's government. Protesters there told me and my colleagues that the rallies had actually grown smaller than in past years, and that because there was less opposition on energy on the streets, all hopes were linked to Donald Trump's promise of external intervention. U.S. media and politicians focused in on an image of the Tienditas Bridge between Colombia and Venezuela, which you can now put on screen. Puedes poner imagen 1. I hope this is right. And here you see a tweet by Mike Pompeo, who is our Secretary of State. And this is the Tienditas Bridge. They neglect to mention, in focusing in on this image, that Venezuela has accepted millions of dollars of aid from organizations like the Red Cross and nations that agree to coordinate with it, like Russia. And that the Tienditas Bridge has actually been off limits to all traffic since it was built in 2015. This is not something that is new. And part of the reason that it's off limits, according to government officials I spoke to, is that Colombia refuses to coordinate customs with the Venezuelan government. There's a black market. There are all kinds of things coming across the border. It's ironic when Donald Trump wants open borders, isn't it? The opposition's plan for humanitarian intervention culminated with an international media extravaganza at the Santander Bridge, not far from the Tienditas Bridge, between Colombia and Venezuela on February 23rd. The attempt to ram trucks across the border loaded with a few $1 million worth of boxes provided by the U.S. Agency for International Development, for Aid and International Development, with no program for distributing the aid, was quite transparently a provocation aimed at generating the political escalation necessary to stimulate a wider U.S. intervention. And it failed in dramatic fashion, as the violent hooligans ferried by Colombian security services onto the bridge wound up burning the aid trucks with their own Molotov cocktails. At the Gray Zone, we were branded as conspiracists for being among the first English language outlets, perhaps the first, to report the fact that the opposition had burned the aid trucks itself. Meanwhile, everyone from Senator Marco Rubio to Colombian President Ivan Duque to USAID Director Mark Green to New York Times correspondent Nicholas Casey falsely blamed Maduro for burning the aid trucks. 2 weeks later, the New York Times wound up confirming what we at the Gray Zone had already reported, exposing the U.S. public to one of the many deceptions at the base of the push for regime change in Venezuela. The deceptions continued through the electricity blackouts that hit Venezuela on March 7th, just days after Juan Guaido's return from Colombia, when the hydroelectric plant at Guri Dam was mysteriously collapsed. U.S. correspondents have dismissed the government's claim of sabotage as more conspiracism, even as substations subsequently exploded and oil facilities blew up in the Orinoco Belt. At the Gray Zone, I reported on a stunningly cynical memo produced in 2010 by the U.S.-funded soft power outlet known as Canvas, which was responsible for training Juan Guaido and his cadre as youth activists. The memo, authored by Sergej Popovich, who is now rector at St. Andrews University somehow, advised them to exploit looming electricity failures to create a quote-unquote watershed event that would, quote, likely have the impact of galvanizing public unrest in a way that no opposition group could ever hope to generate. Disturbing. I want to show you an image from another deception, which is upon us today and this week from Reuters, image 2. And this Well, you can see what it says. It says, desperate Venezuelans swarm sewage drains in search of water. The Venezuelans are just so stupid or dirty that they just are willing to drink sewage, something no people would do. Actually, the image shows people drinking from an underground freshwater spring that flows into the Guayure River, which many Caracas residents rely on regular occasions, even not during blackouts. As our friends at Venezuela Analysis pointed out, the framing of the photo by Reuters and other embedded outlets was an insult to the poor and working people of Venezuela, suggesting, again, that they were stupid or crazy enough to drink raw sewage. Sorry, it didn't happen. In fact, poor and working class Venezuelans that we spoke to and who most strongly resist the U.S. coup have been imbued with a consciousness that is consistently underestimated in Washington. They have resisted an economic war that's growing more relentless by the day, and they understand that the opposition intends to return them to a time when they were totally politically and economically excluded from their own society. That's why the coup has failed so far, because of them, and why it may never succeed. I hope our friends at the counter event take recognition of that. I'm here on behalf of the American majority, the United States American majority that favors diplomacy and dialogue over economic warfare. And I'm here to add my voice to Professor DeZayas' call for the United Nations to invoke Article 96 and refer unilateral coercive measures like U.S. sanctions to the International Court of Justice to be investigated as a war crime. In the meantime, I and my colleagues will continue to investigate and destroy the deceptions deployed each day to stimulate wars of regime change and interventions behind the false guise of humanitarian concern. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Max, for bringing some fresh air in this house and for generally for the brave investigative work you are doing. We all know that countering mainstream narrative at its cost.
Thank you.
Now Max was saying that they have a short video, 6 minutes video, with some images that they collect in Caracas. We now show this video before giving the floor to Lucrecia.
We are in Parroquia Macarao in the outskirts of Caracas at a food market where food is being sold below market value, subsidized by the city of Caracas, overseen by the mayor of Caracas. And you can see behind me is toothpaste. Here you have all the basic foodstuffs, pasta, flour. They're focusing on protein here, so you have a fish stand and it's being sold well below market rate. And here we have ground up chicken made in Venezuela, which is being sold for about $1.25 or 3,800 bolivares. And then over there are packages, large packages of meat. And back here you can see all the vegetables. And also what you can see are train tracks, because there's an actual metro system in Caracas that services this community. The infrastructure is actually pretty decent. So sardines and vegetable oil here, more protein. And this is the bread stand. It's really cheap. So it's being sold, the large breads are being sold for 2,000 bolivares, which is less than $1 for all that bread. You can get 2 of these for 50 cents. And bread with coconut is being sold for less than $1, about 75 cents. She's taking away a fat bag of food.
We're in a barrio of Caracas called Los Jardines del Valle. We're waiting with a group of people who are here for CLAP. It's a government program in partnership with community groups that distributes a box of basic food goods every single month. The government says that this feeds about 6 million families in a country of 30 million people, and we're here with some of those who are waiting today for their boxes. Okay. And what should people outside of Venezuela know about the food situation right now? Is it fair to say, as we often hear, that there is a humanitarian crisis in Venezuela?
Bueno, básicamente una crisis humanitaria no existe. Hay una crisis de distribución de alimentos. Hay una crisis de especulación de los costos de los alimentos, pero alimentos hay. se pueden conseguir, pero los precios es lo que nos tiene atosigados, lo que no nos permite acceder a ellos, pues.
So one resident who received the clap bag has let us borrow it just to show you what's in it. All the products here are made in Venezuela, and we also see we have some soybean oil, and this soybean oil apparently is made by the government of Venezuela.
I'm Anya Parampil reporting from Simón de Bolívar Square in Caracas, where thousands of Venezuelans have been waiting in line for hours to sign an open letter to the American public denouncing U.S. intervention and aggression against their country.
Allá dicen que nos estamos muriendo de hambre, no, nosotros no nos estamos muriendo de hambre, que nosotros estamos peleando entre nosotros, no, que digan la verdad de lo que está pasando, ¿verdad? Porque nosotros aquí le elegimos un presidente. No a Guaidó que está por allá, no, aquí elegimos a un presidente con voto, ¿ves? Y lo proclamó el pueblo.
Bueno, ellos están quedando mentiras porque yo estoy viendo que el pueblo está apoyando a Nicolás Maduro. Veo que la gente está viniendo a su firma, porque en verdad que, bueno, sí, el país está en crisis, pero también es por el bloqueo que tienen los otros países hacia el país.
Yo estoy aquí por la paz. Yo quiero firmar por la paz, porque yo no creo que haya ningún intervencionismo aquí.
Nosotros vamos a firmar para eso, para que no venga esa guerra aquí.
Aquí no queremos guerra, aquí lo que queremos es paz y felicidad y amor.
Saben que el país está difícil es por la guerra que nos tiene. Aquí elegimos un presidente con votos, que es Nicolás Maduro. Que cese ya la guerra y la violencia hacia el socialismo, por favor, que queremos paz.
We're at a supermarket in Caracas called Gama. This is cheeses. There's a lot of cheeses and meats here. People here like meat, and there's a lot of meats. Okay, we got like congealed meat. We got like so much meat. There's a lot of meat here. I mean, a lot of tomato sauce. You can see the aisles are pretty full of stuff. I mean, they got a whole aisle for pasta. A lot of people love yogurt here. Man. There's energy drinks, all kinds of drinks. Sugars. Got my toilet paper. This toilet paper has chamomile, Manzanilla's chamomile. This is the fruit section. We got a lot of mangoes. There's actually a lot of new beers coming onto the Venezuelan market. They're kind of getting into craft beer. Got wine, a good decent wine section. They have some Chilean wines here. I'm Max Blumenthal here in the Chacao district, very affluent area of Caracas, for a major opposition demonstration on the 5th anniversary of the Guarimba protests. And people are here. They've just seen Juan Guaidó speak. They're very fired up. And the main call here is for humanitarian aid. And so you're calling for humanitarian aid.
Of course, that we need it.
Right. We need it. We need it. We are in a lot of need.
Are you hungry?
Yes.
What would you eat?
Well, anything that I have in my house, but I have to work all day long.
Yeah.
And then go out to find something to buy.
And the prices are too high.
Very high, very high. It's like a bunch of kale. It costs 6,000 bolívares.
Sin embargo, yo tengo aquí como una hora y he visto pasar gente en sillas de ruedas. Las tallas, te invito a ver la talla de mi pantalón. Yo he perdido más de 10 kilos en 2 años.
Protestando porque queremos vivir en libertad, vivir en democracia. Y si no manifestamos, y si no nos ven que estamos disgustados, la gente piensa que estamos bien, como dijo la reportera, que aquí no hay ningún problema porque hay McDonald's y hay para todo.
Thank you for sharing this brilliant reporting. It would be funny if this wasn't used as a pretext for military intervention in Venezuela.
My next guest has just returned a few days ago from a visit to Venezuela. Now, we're hearing a lot about Venezuela, but it's a lot more heat than light in terms of what is actually going on down there. So we're going to talk to him about what he saw and heard while he was there. Max Blumenthal is an investigative journalist and an author. He is editor and co-founder of Gray Zone, the Gray Zone or Gray Zone Project, grayzone.com. And he has a new book coming out next month called The Management of Savagery. First of all, Max, thanks for coming on the program.
Good to be back.
Secondly, when you and I talked last about Venezuela, you hadn't left yet, but we talked about the fact that there was just a cloud of misinformation, a cloud of unknowing around the Venezuelan situation, and the fact that people seem to be reflexively, in at least the way I would put it, falling back into the kind of Cold War attitude about U.S. military intervention in Latin America, where there's almost uniformity of opinion between the two major political parties. There are very few people who are willing to break with the orthodoxy and say that military intervention by this country has a poor record, as a record of being a highly negative force, and that was disappointing. But you subsequently went to Venezuela. You spent, what, 2 weeks there or so?
Like 2.5 weeks.
2.5 weeks. What, if anything, was your takeaway that changed your perception of the situation down there? Did your perception change at all? Was it reinforced? What was your general impression?
Yeah, I'm never terribly shocked when I go into, let's say, a conflict zone or a country that's being targeted by the U.S. for regime change. But I always have to psychologically prepare myself to be somewhat wrong. So I came in mentally prepared to see more economic and human despair than I expected to see. I said, what if the U.S. media is right? Like maybe, the situation is worse than I think. And what I found was that the situation, at least in Caracas and the surrounding states, was far more stable than I expected. The opposition was far more weak than I had anticipated. The coup had much less momentum and was indeed a reality show, kind of virtual reality coup. And I was actually stunned at how, despite an economic crisis, which was real, how functional daily life in Venezuelan society in Caracas was, down to the situation in the poor and working class barrios, where people are subsisting thanks to state-subsidized food, what they call the CLAP boxes. The CLAP is the government program to supply the basic foodstuffs and sanitary needs for people who are living off of very meager salaries at a time of hyperinflation. And, getting to visit those markets, talking to the people in the barrios, and seeing government ministers, including the mayor of Caracas, who's a really interesting person, Erica Farias, actually, come to the markets and meet with constituents, and to see the support they get, just the genuine grassroots support they get, it really shows you that what we're hearing from these, Senate committees like the one that Marco Rubio chaired today about, this being a kind of crime family and a regime with no support in the streets that's on its way to collapsing is just a bunch of hot air. It's a psyop, another humanitarian interventionist psyop. And I think one of the most remarkable scenes for me was on February 23rd. That was the day when the U.S. planned to ram through its so-called humanitarian aid across the Santander Bridge between Colombia and Venezuela. This was the big stunt where they were going to either try to create some provocation where the Venezuelan government prevents the aid from coming in, and then they point the finger and say, you don't want foreign aid, you want to keep your people starving, even though they're allowing tons of aid from other countries that's coordinated in. Or they get the aid in and, something else happens. But basically the aid was a Trojan horse for intervention. They prevented it from coming in. And I had a ticket to go to the border that day on the Venezuelan side. And I chose to stay in Caracas because I thought it was going to be more interesting to see how the opposition internally behaved. And I learned that the opposition had directed its supporters to the La Carlota Air Base, which was a military air base that happened to be within walking distance from where I was staying at a rental in an opposition stronghold. The opposition focuses in the east of Caracas in a very affluent area which would kind
is
of...
Is this the one, is it country club, or is it...
It feels like it,
yeah,
you know?
Yeah.
Or it feels like, you know, going from the West Bank to, or East Jerusalem to, like, Tel Aviv.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it feels like people are lighter skinned there. There's sushi restaurants in the street. There's food, you know, gourmet food delivery places. You know, you're facing this beautiful green hill that people don't have sight of in the poorer barrios. And there's anti-Maduro graffiti everywhere. People are celebrating the opposition leader, Leopoldo Lopez. He used to be the mayor. This is Chacao, Altamira, Palos Grandes, that area.
Mm-hmm.
So there happened to be this military air base there. So basically, the opposition just sent all its people out of their houses to surround it and to kind of stay there until the military defected. And so I went down there, and there was a pretty sizable crowd, and you could see mixed in among the crowd of white people, and they all wear white shirts for some reason, and they look like they're at a country club, you know, and it's a country club style atmosphere. Everybody's greeting each other. People are waving U.S. flags. This opposition leader named Maria Corina Machado shows up, and she is Rubio's proxy in Caracas. She's been involved in regime change coup plots, assassination plots. She's very close to the U.S., one of the most extreme figures. She's openly called for an R2P style intervention, and she bursts through the crowd and stands up in front of the military base on a makeshift stage like Evita and starts giving this, you know, speech calling for the liberation of Venezuela, and let's, you know, convince the military that we've been demonizing for years, that we're their friends, and yada, yada, yada. And then she storms out, and all of a sudden the crowd starts to dissipate, and the crowd just follows her out, and I stand around and I'm waiting for something to happen. And I was going to say, I can see that there are a few people who stand out within the crowd who are darker skinned youth, who are the guarimberos, who actually are the kids who were wearing gas masks. Some of them have masks on, and they're the ones who who really formed the front lines of the violent riots that held Caracas under siege in 2016, 2017, and killed many cops. Many bystanders were killed.
So they're also, just to interrupt, so they're also part of the same
in there in
opposition movement, but they
come from a different class.
Yeah.
They're totally nihilistic, and they're basically mercenaries. They're like, a lot of them are like street kids who get paid to do this, but they're not ideological like the, you know, people who are riding nice motorcycles down to the protest and, you know, live in nice luxury apartments, or upper middle class people can afford sushi. In any case, I'm like, is something going to happen here? Like, these kids are out here. I haven't seen them before. Is this going to turn into a guarimba? And then everybody just leaves. And they just left. And I walked up in the neighborhood in Altamira, and everybody was going in for Chinese food. They were all going for lunch after the protest. It was like they went out for a picnic, an anti-Maduro picnic. And there's this whole Chinese restaurant that's filled. I look inside, and everybody's wearing a white shirt in there. And it's the upper middle class people having lunch, and a guy yells into the window, "Maduro!" And then the whole restaurant bellows out, "Coño tu madre!"
Which
means,
we won't translate because we are FCC regulated, but it's basically a rude suggestion about your mother's anatomy.
The point is, they just gave up.
So
by 3 p.m., they'd totally given up. And I was sitting at an Italian restaurant across the street, and it was over. And that was the end of the coup. The coup, I just watched the coup end right then and there on February 23rd.
So, okay, there are a lot of implications there. I want to explore this for a minute. Max Blumenthal, number one, why did they go if they weren't going to stay? I mean, were they just killing a few hours? What was the impetus? Who told them there's going to be a thing happening and you should go? And why did they go? And if they went, why did they leave?
Let me explain it this way. We've heard a lot of bluster about intervention, and many of us in the anti-war community have worried about another humanitarian intervention that would turn Venezuela into a Libya-style dystopia and destabilize the region. And people even in governments in the Lima group, the right-wing Lima group, have the same concern because they are on the borders of Venezuela and they don't want their countries to be destabilized. The Brazilian military is very worried about this. They don't want to go as far as Jair Bolsonaro. The Costa Rican government has been very worried about this. Even Guatemala, which is run by this like reality show TV clown who's a lot, Jimmy Morales, who's a lot like Trump, openly said we can't have military intervention. And these Russian pranksters who've done a lot of prank calls to world leaders actually got Elliot Abrams on the line. It hasn't been written about in the U.S., of course, but it was a very revealing phone call. Elliot Abrams, demonstrating great operational security, really shows his cards. And he tells them, he thinks that they're the president of, he's speaking to the president of the Swiss Federation, who's going to tell him where Maduro's secret bank accounts are. When, you know, he's speaking to someone with clearly a thick Russian accent, who's just pulling his chain. And at the in a subsequent call to these pranksters, Abrams said, "Well, we have to keep threatening military invasion just to scare the Venezuelan military, but we're not actually going to do it. We're just waging economic warfare." So he basically admits that they can't do it. They don't have the diplomatic support. They don't have the support within Venezuela. Even opposition people would hate a war, and they tell me, like, we're totally against a war.
And you published, at Gray Zone, you published a poll showing that 86% of the people, including a lot of the people who would be politically opposed to the current government, don't want U.S. military intervention.
This is from a firm called Interlaces. Also, 81% are against sanctions. But they've been told... you know, the U.S. has been pushing this line that, you know, we might intervene, we might do it, we're totally behind you. And they sent the same message actually to the Syrian opposition and said, you know, we're going to give you some weapons, but eventually we're going to come in with air power, so start fighting. And so the Venezuelan opposition...
It's what we did is what the U.S. did to the Kurds in 1991, too.
Yeah, and to the Shia population in southern Iraq after the Gulf War, and said, you know, rise up and we'll come in. And then they rose up and they were crushed. So the Venezuelan opposition had this swell of confidence that they would be supported from the outside in a way that they haven't been. And so basically on the 23rd, I watched them kind of come out and wait for something to happen and stand by the military base and wait for something to happen at the border, and nothing happened. And they don't have a game plan internally to make anything happen. That was crushed, I think, when the Guarimba riots were ended in 2017. That was kind of their last gasp. But now we're starting to see the opposition fracture internally, with Juan Guaido starting to kind of drift away alone on the back seat of a motorcycle, while the rest of the opposition groups say, like, what are we doing here? Like, the military isn't defecting. Maybe we should engage in some talks. Do we really want these sanctions to come down? It's going to make the economic situation worse. And I think that Marco Rubio, if you watched his performance today in the Senate on the Foreign Relations Committee, Marco Rubio was even like facing some opposition from the experts he brought in from the Wilson Center, who were even saying the sanctions will cause starvation, and people who are starving do not protest. Rubio is increasingly isolated. I think the whole thing is kind of falling apart. What will happen, however, are deepening sanctions. I mean, I don't think the U.S. can turn back from that. They're going to double down, partly out of humiliation.
For a lot of people, you know, one of the reasons we're talking again about Venezuela is a lot of people are being seriously misinformed, in my opinion, about what's going on there in this country. And one of the things that people have heard, and this is why I want to kind of hammer at this point a little bit, one of the things that people have heard is that we and some generous-minded people like Richard Branson, the billionaire, tried to get some food into the poor, starving Venezuelans over this bridge from Colombia, and the military wants for people to starve, the Venezuelan military. They wouldn't allow it in. And so I think a lot of people formed this mental picture that the Venezuelan people are starving because...
These people who have formed that mental picture don't have a mental picture. I mean, how could you be that dumb?
Well, I don't think people are... I think people are misinformed by the U.S. media. I don't think it's a matter of the average person. I mean, I think if people are told certain things, they have a tendency to believe them. A lot of people do. So that's the people I'm talking about here. And I think that if people come away thinking, well, I saw a story, they tried to get food to the people who were starving because of their dictator, Maduro, and the dictator wouldn't let the food in, that's as much as they know. And they may have heard the word sanctions, but listen, I've been around political communications for too long. I know that sanctions is not a concept that every voter understands, even the word, okay? So what we're really talking about here, I mean, that's why I want to unpack that a little bit, if you bear with me. One is sanctions means, in this case, the prevention of certain items getting to the population of a country, right?
Including insulin, which the U.S. has obstructed from reaching Venezuela through sanctions.
So if we sanction, if our sanctions are preventing insulin from getting to the Venezuelan people, it's a medical fact that Venezuelans are dying as a result of our actions, because that's what happens to a diabetic that can't get insulin. So they're dying in this country because they can't afford it. They're dying in Venezuela if it's being sanctioned. What else is being sanctioned or prevented from getting to the Venezuelan people by our government policies?
Well, the Colombian and U.S. intelligence services have actually set up a group to prevent the importation of medicines and medical supplies to Venezuela. The AP reported in February that a young person who was seeking, I think, cancer treatment or a stem cell transplant has been prevented from receiving that in Europe due to U.S. sanctions on a foundation that was paying for child cancer treatment that was funded through Citgo, which is the U.S. arm of the Venezuelan oil company. And, you know, Venezuela funds, you know, since the election of Hugo Chavez, has funded a lot of social programs through PDVSA, which is the state oil company. The U.S. is now preventing Venezuela's government from receiving assets for oil sales by forcing all foreign buyers to pay assets into a separate account controlled by the U.S. Department of Treasury, which supposedly goes into the pocket of the self-proclaimed, you know, coup puppet leader Juan Guaido, which means that they don't receive assets on oil sales, so they can't not only restructure their debt, offset the speculation black market economy by imposing price controls and keeping prices lower for the poor on food. They can't purchase food, unlike Nicaragua, which has anywhere from 70 to 90% food sovereignty, meaning they produce that much of their own food. Most of Venezuelan food and medicine is imported, and so they're unable, the government is increasingly unable, thanks to sanctions, to import medicine and food. This is the goal. And today, Marco Rubio said that sanctions and widespread unrest, by encouraging sanctions and widespread unrest, we will bring down this government, which he calls a crime family. So the U.S. is doing this deliberately. It's a long-standing tactic. It was done to Iran and caused a lot of hardship in Iran to bring them to the negotiating table and produce the Iran deal. And the U.S. just kept trying to get a better deal by, like, making the economy scream. But it's something the U.S. has done to Iraq as well. There was a Lancet study which said that, 500,000 Iraqi children had died due to sanctions. That study's been challenged, but, you know, when it was put to Madeleine Albright, then the Secretary of State, she said, even if the numbers were inflated, she said it was still worth it. So that's the mentality of the sociopaths inside the Beltway, is that we will make people die in order to achieve our political goals. So sanctions is warfare by other means, and you're right. You're right. You know, the average voter, including a progressive voter, doesn't consider sanctions a form of warfare, so Washington tends to get away with it. And then you bring in, like, the attempt at U.S. aid. I think it was like $200 million of aid, while they've blocked, already they've seized $17 billion in Venezuelan assets in the last 2 months. So it's a drop in the bucket compared to what they've seized. And they had no plan to distribute it. The opposition had signed up like 30,000 people to distribute it, but they had no plan to get it to people in need. It didn't actually contain vital medicines. It was basically the same kind of food that the government distributes to millions of people every day. So, you know, the government already has that taken care of. It was just a Trojan horse to invade Venezuelan territory and to create a provocation. And so there was this scene on the bridge on the 23rd of February that the whole world was supposed to be watching just so we could see Maduro's cruelty. And what the U.S. did was kind of deploy Colombian security forces, which then brought these violent Guarimbero youth, many of them were Venezuelan exiles, some were just Colombians, to escort the trucks carrying the aid to the bridge to confront Venezuelan riot police with Molotov cocktails. And towards the end of the day, they just tossed Molotov cocktails onto the back of one of the aid trucks. The aid burned, and then they blamed the Venezuelan government for burning the aid. And that was kind of the provocation that they attempted to stage. And I produced video of them throwing the Molotov cocktail straight up onto the truck. The Colombian president comes out, Ivan Duque, this right-wing U.S. vassal, and he says that Maduro's so cruel, he burned the aid. Marco Rubio says the same thing. But the provocation really fell flat. It didn't lead to anything else, and now we're back at, increasing sanctions again. And this is where it kind of gets interesting, because we watched the U.S. lose in Syria, and for the first time since the Cold War, the kind of unipolar order was flouted as the Syrian government called on allies in Russia, Iran, Hezbollah, and mobilized its own population to stop this multi-billion-dollar regime change war. And they won. The situation's been stabilized. The U.S. is pulling its troops out under the watch of Donald Trump. Venezuela is now mobilizing its allies, China, Russia, Turkey. It actually has a lot of allies in the Caribbean, Cuba, Bolivia, all these countries that are sort of a non-aligned group that aren't aligned with the U.S. and in many ways are pushing back against the unipolar hegemony. And if they can provide Venezuela with alternative sources of assets to sell its oil to, and if Venezuela can start importing medicines and goods from China, which isn't even now one of the top 4 sources of imports, it will be another gigantic blow to the U.S. ability to control the world in its own hemisphere, where John Bolton has openly said, we're trying to enforce the Monroe Doctrine. It would be this would represent a titanic shift in the world order. And so I think that's why it's really important to keep watching it as we see the world change before our eyes.
That's really interesting. That's a really interesting aspect of this. If you are, as I am, if one is, as I am, not a fan of empire as a concept or the American empire as an undertaking that this country should be involved in, that's an interesting development. But if you are a promoter of America as an empire, if you're a John Bolton or a Madeleine Albright or anyone else who thinks that, in fact, we should, whether you say it or not, that we should be imposing our will on this hemisphere and elsewhere, as it turns out, this seems to me, what you're saying pretty clearly is this is a counterproductive course of action, because the more they push, the more they're going to expose vulnerabilities, the more other players are going to come in and fill the gap, and we will have, in effect, an outpost of the post-American empire world order in South America. Is that a fair take?
Just as one example of how the U.S. has scored an own goal, it is now receiving record levels, I'd say record meaning in the last decade, record levels of oil imports from Russia to offset the oil.
It meaning Venezuela.
The United States is importing a level of oil from Russia that hasn't been seen in over a decade, since it really kind of initiated the new Cold War and started pushing back against Russia to offset the oil that it refuses to accept from Venezuela. So it just shows how the U.S. is not, what it's trying to do to Venezuela is, on a global scale, an act of self-sabotage. From the imperial perspective.
From the imperial perspective.
And, Venezuela had depended heavily on U.S. refineries because their crude oil needs to be mixed with light crude, and they could only do that in Texas at the Citgo refineries, and now the U.S. is saying no, so Russia's helping them, refine their oil with Russian light crude, and it's like taking the U.S. offline, taking the U.S. economy offline and forcing the U.S. to depend more on Russian oil imports while the U.S. is trying to, start this new Cold War with Russia. It doesn't make sense.
Well, it's interesting because it's fascinating, too, because there are two kind of post-Westphalian powers at work in what you describe, and the Westphalian, the identification of nation states and so on. One is the American empire, which is obviously projected well beyond the borders of the United States. The other is the empire of oil and the oil corporations and their own power. What I was thinking when you were talking about this shift is that, for example, Rex Tillerson, Trump's first Secretary of State, former CEO and chairman of ExxonMobil, by my view, leader of one of the greatest crimes against humanity ever, which is the concealment of oil's effect on climate change for many years, which is a crime of such magnitude it's incalculable in a way. But his great diplomatic, quote-unquote, claim to fame, since he had never served in government before going to work for Trump, was, as I recall, if I recall correctly, was doing oil deals with Russia. So you have this sort of these two post-nation-state entities, the American empire hurting American empire interests by imposing this sanction, and then you have the oil industry finding other solutions elsewhere and importing Russian oil to the U.S. Does that make any sense? And are we seeing a kind of breakdown of, are we seeing a kind of chaos or anarchy of an overreaching empire actually dissolving in front of our eyes? Because that's the image I get.
There are fractures in the empire for sure. But I'm glad you brought up Tillerson. There have been all these quotes that I've seen about Donald Trump on his first day declaring that he wanted to do regime change in Venezuela, and that this was Trump's priority. And I wonder who would have supplied those quotes to the media, because I don't actually see Donald Trump caring about Venezuela or thinking on the first day of his administration about anything relating to Venezuela. It just doesn't seem Trumpian to me. It's like, he's thinking about maybe some war room thing or how he can have a military parade or something to make himself seem great. I think Tillerson is supplying those quotes. I think Tillerson is heavily involved behind the scenes. That it was Tillerson on the first day who wanted regime change in Venezuela because of his relationship with Exxon. And Exxon really wants access to those oil fields and to just the oil reserves, which represent the largest oil reserves in the world are in Venezuela. Some of them are untapped. And Venezuela traditionally had been rented since World War I by U.S. oil companies, to the point where Hitler sent his U-boats during World War II to sink oil tankers coming out of Venezuela because they were supplying the U.S. war machine. Exxon was getting oil at a very favorable rate until Hugo Chavez came along, and they would like to go back to that. And if you look closely at Juan Guaido's, which is not really Juan Guaido, but the Plan País, it's just this neoliberal plan for returning the economy to international finance and the extraction industries. Exxon, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, these groups, they're funding a think tank in Washington called the Council on the Americas, which was founded by David Rockefeller as a corporate roundtable for Latin America. And they testified, they brought one of their experts before Rubio today, Eric Farnsworth. They're supplying a lot of the quotes to mainstream media about how Maduro's running a crime family. They're really marketing the U.S. regime change effort, and they're doing so on behalf of their funders, the arms industry, the extraction industry, and international finance. And it's because they want to remove a government that has attempted to impose some kind of democratic socialism on an economy that was previously a neoliberal, libertarian petrostate that guys like Rex Tillerson wanted to feast off of. So Tillerson's still a big player in this, and so is Exxon, and this indeed is about oil. Just one other point about oil. Oil was central to the success of Chavismo. The price of oil was $80 a barrel in the golden days of Chavismo, which was 2006, 2007. 2007 is when the U.S. started coming in with its soft power organizations and trying to mess things up. That's when they started training Juan Guaido and his leader, Leopoldo Lopez. And one of the biggest successes for the U.S. was when as far as regime change in Venezuela went, was in 2014 when the price of the oil barrels went down dramatically. Why did it go down? Because, and this was reported in the Wall Street Journal, in oil industry publications at the time, that John Kerry had made a deal with, I think, King Abdullah in Saudi Arabia, or it was the Crown Prince, to increase Saudi capacity production in order to harm Russia, Iran, and Venezuela, which rely heavily on high oil prices. And in exchange, Saudi Arabia would gain U.S. support in Syria, and the U.S. would increase its delivery of weapons to Saudi-backed rebels. This was reported openly in the Wall Street Journal. And this is what tanked the Venezuelan economy and made it so hard for Venezuela's government to start to offset the speculatory black market economy with price controls. This was kind of the beginning of the crisis that we're now seeing. And so it wasn't something that occurred organically. It was due to the petrodollar and the U.S. special relationship with Saudi Arabia. Maduro actually came out and openly said they're doing this to harm Russia, when he himself was a target.
Now, not only is it, the other implication of that, of course, is that it was done to undermine the form of government that Venezuela had chosen for itself. So I guess for just my closing thought is this. I mean, what you're really describing, there's a lot of talk now here in this country about Green New Deal, about a jobs guarantee, about, and a debate where I stand on this debate is that we have to look at these things in a kind of systems way, in an integrated way, that you can't eliminate or reduce our dependence on climate-destroying fossil fuels without also changing our economic system that generates that, that allows people to exploit that. And I think a lot of people who consider themselves progressive in this country understand that it's a puzzle with pieces that fit together. But I think for a lot of people, that mental puzzle image is missing a very big piece. And that piece is foreign policy. And that if you don't understand the way that petropolitics and other kinds of geopolitics and military adventurism, or whatever you want to call it, imperial policies play into all of this, you don't have a fully three-dimensional view of the world. And it's critical not only as a moral imperative, because we're for American citizens, but just and for a complete understanding of the world around you, to understand what's going on in a country like Venezuela.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a subject that I've had to play catch up on just to understand the motives behind regime change in Venezuela. And then there's also the dollar, the dominance of the dollar, and how when a country threatens to, or a government threatens to de-link its economy from the dollar, for example, Libya's Muammar Gaddafi said he was going to back his currency with gold. A year later, he faced a pretty intense regime change plot which ended with him being sodomized with a bayonet by U.S.-backed al-Qaeda allies from the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. I think there was an attempt, or there were discussions in Syria of doing something similar. Iran, this is another country that's tried to, link its currency to gold, and other, the Chinese yuan is a huge threat to the U.S., also Chinese technology. And I think after Iraq, we're not really looking towards a future of conventional warfare where the U.S. is going to try to confront militaries head on and risk losing a lot of the guys in the Rust Belt whose families are Trump's base. What they want to do is economic warfare, trade wars with China, and sanctions. And this kind of thing happens below the radar of most Americans. I think progressives who are concerned about foreign policy and war need to pay closer attention to the details of these policies, because ultimately it is creating instability and it will generate blowback here one way or another.
And people who think we're an ennobling force, who still think that the United States is an ennobling force, should remember you've described briefly the horrific nature of Gaddafi, whatever you think of Gaddafi, the horrific nature of his death, to which then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton said, we saw, he died.
And then she cackled.
And laughed.
You know, that should have disqualified her, along with the fact that she and Barack Obama presided over the return of slavery to the African continent in Libya. But,
also under-reported, deliberately altered the reporting of child slavery in, Malaysia, in I think it was rubber tree cultivation in order to enact a trade deal. So we could go on and on with examples of this. But
I think we should put this to the candidates in 2020 and really force them to address the issue of sanctions, which do harm ordinary people. And that's another thing for progressives to do. The people who watch your show should make this a source of debate, including for Bernie, who really hasn't taken a strong stand against sanctioning Venezuela, and all the money that we're putting into all of these fake soft power groups that just destabilize countries should come back here. And finally, why are we talking about food instability in Venezuela when there's so much of it surrounding this neighborhood where this studio is situated? Something very few politicians on the national stage talk about. Isn't it weird to talk about it in other countries? And we never talk about food instability and hunger in the U.S.
And it's a great point on which we are unfortunately going to have to end. But this neighborhood, Anacostia, is a food desert. It is a place where
there's no supermarket here.
There's no so couldn't agree more. And unfortunately, we are going to have to leave it there. But Max Blumenthal, journalist, editor of the Gray Zone Project, grayzone.com, and author of the forthcoming book, The Management of Savagery. Again, thanks so much for coming on the program.
Thanks a lot, RJ.